Hey, it's time again for Arrested DevOps. Welcome to episode 25, DevOps in the Enterprise. I'm your co-host, Matt Stratton, at Matt Stratton on Twitter.
And I'm today's number one, Trevor Hess, because we're talking about the enterprise. Um, Trevor G. Hess on Twitter.
Kind of screws you up when you go off script, doesn't it, Trevor?
It always does. Ad-libbing doesn't work very well anymore. I used to be very good at it.
So, Arrested DevOps is brought to you by their cloud services team at 10thmagnitude.com.
We all know that being on call sucks, but what if there was a tool out there that allowed you to route incidents to the right team, mention specific people to ask for help, and hop in to chat with your team from an easy-to-decipher incident timeline that gave you full context of what was happening? That tool is VictorOps, and they're different. From setting up global on-call rotations to creating a post-mortem report, VictorOps is there with you through every step of the incident lifecycle. Our real-time collaboration platform helps your team to solve their problems. DevOps.com/VictorOps to sign up.
This episode is also sponsored by Redgate Software. Redgate makes tools that bring the benefits of continuous delivery, safe releases, efficient development, and fast feedback to your database. Find out more about database lifecycle management, download free trials, and browse the Database Delivery Learning Program at arresteddevops.com/redgate.
We're also pleased to share some big news. Joining us tonight for her first appearance as official co-host is Bridget Cromhout. Bridget, can you tell our audience a bit about yourself and introduce our topic and panel?
Hi, thanks, Trevor. Trevor and Matt, I'm so happy to join Arrested DevOps. My name is Bridget Krumhout, and I'm an operations engineer at Drama Fever. We're a streaming video site for international content, and we're a small startup, though we're hiring. Got to put that in there. But I have been a BOFH at places many hundreds of times this size. And it's fascinating seeing the changes happening in our industry as large organizations start embracing DevOps. So I'm pretty excited to talk to our panel today about this topic.
Yeah, it's awesome to have Bridget join us. It's giving us a little bit more breadth of coverage, although it does tip the show a little more opsy than Debbie, so Trevor is now officially outnumbered. So that's kind of fun. Also, if you're listening, if you're into that IRC thing, feel free to hit us up on Freenode and pound Arrested DevOps during the show or on the Twitters at Arrested DevOps with any questions you might have for our panel.
All right, so for the panel today, we have to talk about DevOps in the enterprise. We have Michael Ducy of Chef, Ross Clanton of Target, and Steve Pereira of MyPlanet. So we'll start with Mike. Can you give us a bit of background on yourself and your thoughts on this whole DevOps, or shall we say enterprise DevOps business?
I guess my thoughts on the whole enterprise DevOps business is that the foundational core of DevOps is the same, and no matter where you're at, the principles apply of like continuous improvement and trying to make your organization better. And then there are nuances in the enterprises, just because there's sometimes more political stuff, but that's not always the case. In a large organization than there is in a small organization. And then those little nuances just make how you dance around those issues different, right? And so that's my kind of general idea, is that DevOps is DevOps is DevOps.
Great, thanks. And Ross, can you give us a bit of your background and how you became exposed to DevOps?
Yeah, so I do management stuff at Target. I lead part of our ops organization.
You're not making any sounds.
Ah,
Try that again, Ross. There you go.
Now you're
I'm
making
not muted. That is
Huh.
weird.
Well, we can hear you now. So.
I saw all the hand signals, so I was picking up on it. I was wondering what was going on, though. All right. So yes, did you hear me at all?
We heard I am Ross.
I am Russ. All right. I do management stuff. I lead part of our ops organization at Target. My kind of partner in crime, Heather McMahon.
Oh my.
Arrested DevOps is experiencing technical difficulties. Please enjoy a picture of a cat, or this real cat, in the meantime.
I think we're going to have to come back to Ross.
We are switching. No more headset.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you. We can hear you when you want to say, "Can we hear you?" And then you start talking.
All right, let's back this up. Ross, I'm going to ask you this question one more time. Ross, can you give us a bit of your background and how you became exposed to DevOps?
I feel like I've heard this question before. So yes, I lead part of our ops function at Target. So I do management stuff. Really passionate about DevOps. You've probably heard my partner in crime, Heather McMahon, and I out talking in the public forum, as well as trying to get more people exposed to what Target's doing in this space. I agree with Ducy in that DevOps is DevOps, whether you're an enterprise, a startup, a unicorn, whatever. We do have a lot of challenges with the technology debt that we've built over the years at a large enterprise like Target, and just going through that shift and that mindset shift across a large organization is an interesting, unique challenge, I think, that is fun. And it's rewarding, it's frustrating, it's all kinds of things, but it really kind of keeps me motivated day in and day out to drive some of the changes that I think need to be driven.
Awesome. Thanks, Ross. So, Steve, why don't you tell us a bit about your DevOps?
I'm not going to claim to have any DevOps personally. My DevOps is all DevOps. All DevOps is me. Toronto, I run the... What's that? Did I get cut off?
You did, Steve. Could you tell us more about how after DevOps is you, what are you actually doing in this space?
Sure. So I've been in IT for about 14 years. I live and work in Toronto for a company called MyPlanet, and I basically help big companies get started with DevOps and Agile and automation and fun stuff like that. I run the DevOps meetup in Toronto and the OpenStack meetup in Toronto, and I'm organizing DevOps Days Toronto again for 2015 in May.
And I'm glad you brought that up because I was so excited to be here. I did forget to mention that I also help organize DevOps Days Minneapolis along with some of these fine folks. So can you tell us a little bit, Steve, about your perspective? Because I think you've been to a number of DevOps Days now. Can you tell us a little bit about your perspective of how DevOps Days intersects with or informs some of what you're doing in these large organizations?
Yeah, absolutely. I think DevOps Days is this magical camp where we all sort of get away from our jobs and hang out as curious peers and interesting people who just want to have conversations about this very broad and controversial topic and discuss what we do and the problems we have and the solutions we have. And I find it totally fascinating and super engaging and really energizing to both attend and with my experience organizing. It was my first time being involved in a conference at all. And it was to get started with speaking or organizing or any way you want to be involved in the community.
Yeah, and one of the things I think, speaking of DevOps days, I know, and I don't have all the details on it, but kind of talking about where that connects into uh, introducing DevOps into an enterprise or into a larger organization. I know, Ducy, you were involved with Target did an internal DevOps days of some kind, and could you guys, you and Ross, maybe explain like what that is? Because I know some places do that, and I'd like to know more about it.
Yeah, so I've actually been involved in two. I've been involved at one at ING Bank in the Netherlands, and then I've also been involved with the DevOps Days Target as well. And so what I find really interesting about it is it really breaks down the traditional kind of corporate walls, and it allows you, and DevOps Days as well also kind of breaks down the traditional conference walls that you have, and it allows you to kind of communicate on a level you're often feel like you maybe aren't allowed to, either in a conference or in a large organization. So getting everybody together to do an open space and to communicate and share and that whole spirit of collaboration really kind of, I think, opens things up and changes the norm. Ross, what are your thoughts, and why did you bring DevOps Days Target to bear?
Yeah, actually, I would totally agree. So we, almost a year ago now, Heather and I kind of decided that we wanted to do this whole DevOps Days at Target internal conference, and we've done them quarterly now. We've done 3 of them. We've got our annual one coming up here in February. And Ducey's absolutely right. The intent is really to kind of get people across functions or across silos to connect and to make it an inclusive thing where people are coming because they choose to be there. And we actually have a tagline we've used for our internal DevOps days called Connect, Share, Learn. And it really is about that. It's about getting people across our organization to connect. It's about sharing the things that are happening that people are doing, because they're, as start and grow that out is for people to share that and get them connected with others so they can see what's happening. And that kind of leads to the last part, learn. By doing that sharing, by bringing in external folks as well as internal folks that are focused on this, people are able to learn and see from experts and people in the industry around what's happening and people internally in the company. And so yeah, Ducy was actually part of our first DevOps days. We had him and Rob Cummings from Nordstrom as our 2 external speakers, and it was awesome. We didn't know, Heather and I, when we kicked this thing off, we didn't know if we're gonna have 50 people. We had about 170 people for the first DevOps days. It was a really good turnout, and we've incremented even more every one since then. So it's continued to gain momentum, and I think Ducy still has one of the top-rated talks, the goat in the silo, that we had in our first one. That's still discussed by a lot of our engineers internally all the time.
Well, he is the goat father, so, or is he self-styling himself goatologist at this point? I'm trying to read that. It's so blurry.
Well, the other thing that's interesting is that what a lot of corporations don't realize, or what enterprises don't realize, is they have enormous tech communities within them themselves. And for a number of years, they haven't leveraged those tech communities very well to kind of build those communities and share in it. And I think as you begin to open up the door and let's have our own little internal conference and let's talk about things, you realize how much more is going on in the organization, right? And what other people are working on that's awesome, right? And I think leveraging that tech community is really important, and building those kind of internal communities are something that has been missing.
As well as, Ducy, you were also instrumental in actually getting Ross and Heather to come talk at DevOps Days Minneapolis, because you knew them from your association with Target through Chef.
Yeah, exactly. But the other thing is Target is a large, well-known organization in Minneapolis. Yeah, and for good or bad, Target's not always had the best reputation as the most awesome place to work at. But if you get Ross and Heather up there talking about the transformation that's actually taking place, it changes everybody's mind that maybe the assumptions that we had in the past of Target are no longer true, right? And I think Target is beginning to kind of prove people that they are changing and they are changing for the better, and that it is possible to change in a large enterprise.
We
Yeah, I
are
think
not
that
to look at. Go ahead, Bridget. You really.
So one of the things that I kind of think about when I think about the traditional conversations that come up when we have this whole, like, is there a different way to do DevOps if you're the enterprise, and what comes up a lot is this, kind of if we think about, and this is sort of my perspective when I think about where the challenge comes in the conversation. So we talk about CAMs, right? And it sounds like a lot of the people, a lot of the folks, or a lot of the belief is that, well, if you're going to do, the way that I interpret quote unquote enterprise DevOps is AMS, right? Well, we don't need the hippy dippy culture shit, right? We just need some fucking good automation and some good stats, and because that's a thing that we can do, and we don't need all this huggy bullshit. And the thing that is, I think, the downside of that is that you can't cherry pick, right? I mean, the things go together, but there's a perception that comes out that within the belief of what's quote unquote traditional DevOps is that it's very within the quote unquote DevOps. And by the way, I get like paid $1 apparently every time I say quote unquote, so that's what I'm saying a lot. Within the sort of traditional DevOps community, some of these are things we've sort of already figured out. Like, we already know automation is awesome. We already know you need that. We already know that. We've kind of maybe feel like we've addressed some of this, so that's why lately we might be all like, hey, let's talk about empathy all the time, because that's our hot thing to talk about in 2014. That's our magic word. And I'm not dismissing it at all, but we're talking about it a lot. And this is the time when that crossover's happening, when now we've got, the Chases of the world and the Wells Fargos of the world, and I'm not picking on them, I'm just saying big old companies, right, are coming in and they're like, let's look at this. I'm like, oh, all these DevOps days, all they talk about is like empathy and shit, and they don't talk about automation. So maybe there's kind of, because the traditional DevOps community is ahead of the curve in some ways, we're focusing in one thing. I don't know. Do you think that might be part of where there's this belief that quote unquote, God dang it, so-called traditional DevOps is culture heavy?
So Ross, you went to DOS 14, didn't you? And
Yeah.
What did you see as far as talks there?
Yeah, well,
And DOS, sorry for everyone who doesn't know, DOS is DevOps Enterprise Summit, which was held recently, which Gene Kim and John Willis and others put on in San Francisco.
And
Yeah,
I believe
well-
Steve was actually there too, right?
Okay.
I think Ross spoke at it, and I think Steve was an attendee. So
Yeah, I just reckons before the hangout started that Ross was like the speaker from Target. I was like, that's where I know him from.
Yeah, so actually responding to Matt briefly, and then I'll tie it into the DOS response. To me, culture is the most critical part of DevOps, and it's probably the part that Heather and I have continued to focus on the most as we've been trying to drive it at Target. And the reason I say that is culture largely equates to mindsets, and mindsets are how you orient people around how they should work and how they should do things. And if they start doing things and they haven't focused on the mindset, then it's really hard for people to embrace and adopt a different way of working. And I think the other things come kind of naturally as an outcome to that. Culture is also a really, really hard thing to focus on. It's not tangible, it's squishy, it's fluffy. People joke with me internally a lot that it's fluffy stuff when we're talking about it, but it is super, super important. The Enterprise DevOps Summit, I felt like there was a lot of themes there, and I think one was clearly culture. I think in a lot of the talks you heard people focusing on what they were doing to drive culture change. I heard a lot of different approaches. I heard some folks were doing it tops down, some were bottoms up, some where I feel like even where Target's at, it's been a bit of a blend, where they've got a bottoms up movement, which I think is really important, tying back to the kind of community aspect of this. A lot of momentum on that without the right tops down focus as well. But there were other themes as well. I think one theme that I saw that's really resonated with me for large enterprises that have been around a while, that have accumulated technology debt over a number of years, have been through multiple types of architectures, and they all still exist in their environment. You get kind of a spaghetti architecture over time. this idea that enterprises are shifting, and really that everyone is shifting, that we need to optimize for speed. And I think the unicorns, the Web 2.0 companies, I think they got this a while ago. If anything, they've helped to trigger this change because they can move so fast, and that is a competitive advantage in many cases. But I think that the rest of the industry is shifting too, and that was, I saw that across everyone. That was a very clear theme to me, and that's a change. That's a big driver that needs to drive a change in how you operate as an organization, and that's actually, I think, a big driver that kind of has put DevOps in the forefront so quickly, and why it's become such a big trend. It's become a really big trend over the last year. Others' thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I'll weigh in on that. I got a lot of the same impressions from the Enterprise Summit. I thought it was really actually fascinating that so many of these huge companies have come so far. And being, far being a very important word, like a lot of these big enterprises, their transformation process was 3 to 6 years. And so they've been sort of at it for a very long time. And that kind of adds perspective. When we think about the difference between changing culture and changing the way that a business operates at a small scale versus at a very large scale, it just takes, crazy amounts of time when you're dealing with a giant corporation who's not used to steering in new directions. Right? All the other operations, the automation, measurement, and sharing happen sort of within the ship, and the culture is the part that sort of addresses the steering of the giant tanker or the Titanic, and that's a lot harder to influence, right? So I thought that was really interesting, and it was also really interesting to hear that the big companies, a common thread that I heard was that they mess, right? There's a lot of stories about just absolute mess. We can't do anything, and we have to change just because we have no other options. And hopefully, that's not a continuing trend. I hope that was a pioneer thing with the big companies, rather than the cost of adopting change, or the only motivation for change. But that was really interesting to hear.
So, Steve, do you think that what you were hearing is that trying to change brought them a mess, or that they hit rock bottom and decided to change because they had a mess? Like, I'm not sure if you cut out there or what, but I'm not sure if I understood that.
I think it was definitely the latter. I think it was just, they came to realize that they were not hitting time to market the same way that their competition was, or there was something that was stopping them from performing the way that they could, and maybe that's the constraint that they realized. And when you're in a situation like that, you sort of look around for whatever is available, and if DevOps is the new possibility, that could be why they sort of set off in that direction. Because otherwise, I can't see large organizations making that decision lightly, right? They don't just attack what's new. They don't attack things that aren't tried and true and proven. So I think in many cases it was a last resort, but I don't see that trend continuing in the future, because coming out of DevOps Enterprise, there's this huge body of data now that says all these huge companies took the plunge, made it work, and they've got numbers to prove it, and that's going to motivate companies to steer in the right direction before they're headed towards an iceberg.
Yeah, I don't totally agree with you there. So one, I feel like the body of knowledge was there, I think Doe's, the nice thing is that it's put it in one kind of common place. So, but if you hunted for it, you could find it. And then the other thing is that the changes will only still be driven by a, oh my God, I have to, right? Because you don't make real, genuine change, and even if you think about change in your personal life, unless you absolutely have to, right? Because you've hit rock bottom, right? And I think there's going to be a lot more bloodshed before we kind of see this is just the way that we operate, in my opinion. But
So, Ducy, do you think that there's a possibility that there could be a large company that feels like they're operating well, but sees the numbers and results coming out of large companies that are adopting DevOps practices and tries to make that change without feeling like their current business practices are a problem for them? Or do you think that it's like they would say, hey, our current practices work well, until they don't?
I think generally just people are they might see that there's an improvement to be made, and they might make the shift. I can see that happening. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and that I talk it out in my head.
I mean, if there's profit to be gained, right?
Yeah, but everyone says it takes like, so Ross, what was your kind of watershed event of why you guys have decided that you need to change?
Well, I think we're big, so everyone throughout our leadership ranks and within our teams has to have that moment, and it happens at different points, I think, for different people. For me, and this was part, I had kind of rotated around IT in the company, so I played different roles, and I essentially felt like I'd lived like the characters of the Phoenix Project. So when I read the book, it just totally resonated with me right away, and I was coming back into ops after that was kind of where I started. So I was kind of going into where my domain expertise was, but I had a kind of a newfound perspective around where the problems were, and it was around the siloing and the inability to move quickly because of just how we'd kind of structured over time. And then, I just started researching, and as you do that, you gain perspective, and I started talking to folks like Ducy, and we started doing DevOps days, and the more, one thing that is challenging about DevOps, and I think maybe shifting my response here a little bit, one thing that I think makes it so hard to drive this within a large enterprise is one, people are very segmented in large enterprises. They have a role, they have a function they focus on, they're very busy on that thing. And, just like I'm sure in most jobs, they have very demanding jobs. And so they don't have the time often to research and form this type of perspective on their own. And
yeah,
you start digging into DevOps, you just keep digging, because it brings you into all these concepts all over the place. And, go to an enterprise that hasn't heard about these concepts and start talking about infrastructure as code. And even in the early days, start talking about continuous delivery and promise theory and get even deeper and deeper. And you're over people's heads at a certain point, and they'll start to tune you out. And so, like, it's hard, and you've got to figure out how to make it resonate with folks, and don't inundate them with all the concepts, all the language around DevOps, and figure out how to make it stick and make it meaningful for them. So, one thing I think we've even evolved to, because you kind of want to create these aha moments for everyone individually, is figure out what their pain points are and what helps them get past that. And that's a very kind of localized approach. It's a very, it's a time-consuming approach, but that's what it takes from what I've seen internally.
It's interesting that you bring up, Ross, that topic of pain points, because I don't, like I said, I don't work in large companies currently, but I got an interesting email from a gentleman who said it's fine for me to mention that he emailed me from Thomson Reuters, who was actually at DevOps Days Ghent, and saw that I had spoken in there and then was coming to Minneapolis to visit their Minneapolis, meet with some of his other, Thomson Reuters managers and talk to them about some of this DevOps stuff. We met at our local tap room. We ended up talking for hours. I brought Joe, audiovisual guy extraordinaire, and they bought Joe beer and listened to me talk, basically. And the main thing it turns out they wanted to hear about was team chat. Because apparently the huge pain point that they have is when dealing with incidents, everyone sits on a conference bridge, and every few minutes someone joins, and then they have to summarize what's been going on for the person who joined. And they have to hear that like 14 times in a row, and it's really frustrating. And I was like, let me show you Slack.
That's awesome. That's such a simple pain point.
Yeah.
And two of the gentlemen, it was three gentlemen from Thomson Reuters, and two of them downloaded the Slack app while we were sitting there at the Fulton Tap Room. So I have a feeling that they might be experiencing some change coming up soon that could make some of their people very happy.
Yeah, we've been doing a similar thing with HipChat and Slack, I think, in some groups internally. And that's been great. That's created a lot of aha moments for a lot of folks. That idea of persistent chat and that stuff staying there is great, especially when, you laid out the scenario perfectly, Bridget. I mean, that happens all the time. And that will make people's lives way better when they don't have to keep going through that.
Especially when it just works, not working. When then we go to use HipChat, and HipChat just works.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to worry about it not doing something.
Yeah.
So, and another thing I want to think about when we kind of talk about this sort of idea of, and there's all this conversation about, unicorns and horses and blah, blah, blah and everything. And I know Damon Edwards has said before, and I believe this to be very true, is that the large enterprises are the people that need the DevOps the most, right? Like, the startups don't need it because they're either they're already doing it by definition, or they have DevOps because they have one person, and that person is DevOps, right? Like, it's. I remember I was like at a puppet camp a few years ago, and I was talking to someone there, and I was just starting to get into DevOps, and I was talking to the guy, and he was like, "Yeah," he's like, "We do DevOps. I'm DevOps for this company. I'm the dev and I'm the ops." Right? So there's no silos there, right? Unless he's going to fight with himself. So you don't have these problems. And one of the things that I thought was true, I was just thinking back to a couple of years ago when there was this sort of thought like, hey, DevOps is definitely this thing for these, internet magic companies and everything. And I think that was a lot of perception because who was talking about what they were doing, right? And this plays a little bit into Doze, right? But a couple of years ago, the only people that were talking about doing DevOps were Netflix and Facebooks and Etsy's and blah blah blah, but I don't think that meant that the larger companies weren't doing it. They just were not in a place. And Ross, you might be able to talk about this a little bit. There wasn't this culture around of sharing to the community, right? Like I know there were places I was working where it was like, okay, well we're doing this, but damn it, you better not tell anybody because this is our secret of how we do our magic, and even though we know it's not. And that's what I think is cool about like Bose, right? Is it was like, okay, by the way, here's how we do it, so you don't have to guess. And I think that's the problem with a lot of this assumption of what enterprise DevOps is frankly, it's guessing. It's saying, well, this is how I'm used to an enterprise working, so therefore it must be this way, even though I haven't bothered to actually talk to any people who want to instrument the change, or kind of doing the discovery around that. And I think that's.
Yeah, I'll respond to it more broadly, representing, I think, a traditional enterprise. I don't get into all the target specifics on it, but I think most enterprises are coming from a world where they don't necessarily fully embrace open source. Using open source even can be a challenge, let alone contributing to open source. And so that's one challenge. And we talk about, talking externally. It's rare that enterprises are okay with their folks presenting externally, talking externally public blogs, tech blogs. Those are things you see a lot in the tech community. Those are things you see with startups. Those are things you see with the unicorn companies. And I would say enterprises have typically been slower to adopt those things. I will say I'm excited, looking at where Target's at right now. We're doing all those things right now, and we've obviously had to evolve to that. That's been a journey. But we are now at a point where we're starting to embrace open source, where we're actually starting to contribute in some cases. We have our externally facing tech blog, and that's only been out maybe 3 or 4 months, but that's starting. We're really starting to leverage that to share what we're doing. And we're getting out and we're talking, not just about DevOps, where there's other things. We've sponsored some meetups in the Minneapolis area, software symposium that's more around kind of just general tech topics that we've done. And those are all things that I don't think Target's alone in that right now. I think there's more companies making that shift, but it's indicative, I think, of the shift that's happening in the industry. And I think we will see more enterprises start to shift towards that, but it's gonna be a slog. It's not gonna happen overnight, and it's gonna be the typical change adoption curve that you see. I do feel like Target's on the early end of some of that change, which has been super exciting to be part of.
I think to touch on the whole idea that larger companies are more hesitant to embrace sort of external connections and external influences like open source and stuff, that's definitely what I see as well. And I thought a really interesting thread in the DevOps Enterprise Summit was about like audit and compliance, right? Because I think that's been a major source of fear and reluctance to sort of jump onto the bandwagon or even look at DevOps seriously, because there's this idea that it just makes devs run wild on production, right? And to hear the sessions where they addressed specifically with auditors on the panel, how working together with an auditor within the ideas and principles of DevOps will actually benefit a company rather than hinder them or put them in danger, was amazing to hear. That was one of the coolest parts of it for me. It was this long-held belief that you sort of automate things and make people more empowered in your organization, and that somehow will destroy a company.
I think it's interesting. It's interesting, Steve, that you're mentioning this stuff, and I'm kind of sitting here thinking that I've heard people talk about, the importance of processes, and I know the Thomson Reuters folks were talking about how they've been stuck in this ITIL place and they want to try something different. And I'm wondering, from the DevOps Enterprise perspective, did you get a lot of feel for? Do you hear people like? Both you and Ross, who were at the DOE Summit, do you hear people talking about the culture inside their organizations as much as they talked about the processes? Like, what kind of perspective do either of you have on that?
Yeah, I heard it a lot in conversation. That's still kind of the one aspect that everyone is finding definitely the most challenging and also the most intimidating and scary and the most foreign to them. When you talk about steering an organization, it's kind of something that people look to the leadership for sure. And there's this thought that, being on the ground or being at a level other than the top of the company, you can't really have that much influence. And I really think that that's where sharing is part of the most important aspects of DevOps, because I really think that's how you sort of get the conversation started and sort of get answers from the top of the company about what are the plans around this? Like, have you guys heard of this? Is this something you think about? Are we doing anything in this direction? Because I think it's still pretty intimidating for a lot of people on the ground every day, battling it out, fighting fires, to think about changing a culture of the company that actually makes it better for them to go to work and deal with what they have to do.
And I'm going to pick on you for a second, Ducy, because I know this is the kind of stuff that you addressed with, and we didn't even get to talking about the stuff Steve talked about in his Ignite at Ghent, which was fantastic. The whole idea that DevOps is a MacGuffin. It's just this thing, and we're going to do all this stuff around it. But it's just there as a plot device, okay. And then Ducy also showed us this idea of an overly process-driven dystopia. And this idea that if we look at even, say, CAMs and we adhere too rigidly to it, like if we're going to take whatever it is that we're working on in this space and we adhere too rigidly to it, then that just becomes dogmatic too. Like, can you address that at all, Ducy, in terms of how do we keep this a living thing?
Yeah, so I kind of had this thought earlier in the podcast. So one thing that I've always kind of preached on is this idea that like the tools are easy and the technology is easy. Like we're all really good and you can find really good people to do the technology. It's the culture and even processes are easy, right? Like I can come up with a new process and this is how we make widgets and everybody go make widgets this way, right? Now if everybody makes widgets that way, they probably won't make widgets that way. They'll probably make widgets the way they want to make the widgets. Harder, and I think that's why we tend to focus on them so much. And if we just boil it down to just like process and order and tools, we lose way too much of what it really means, right? Because the organizational management issues are the real challenge, right? And it's an area that nobody has been able to get right fairly well. So. But so I was having this thought as well as we were talking here, and one other thing that kind of came out and spoke to me was that there needs to be this, you know, the DOES summit where we were able to consolidate all of this information about enterprises in one area, and that being very helpful for other enterprises. It's almost like we need an enterprise DevOps podcast as well. So who's with me on starting an enterprise DevOps podcast? Anyone?
I'm game.
Let's do it.
We should do it.
You guys are welcome to it.
We can't call it Arrested DevOps.
We should call it Arrested Enterprise DevOps.
I look forward to listening to this podcast from a safe distance.
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly helping us not have to do follow-up episodes about enterprise DevOps. So, thank you for that. So we'll have to.
It's not that bad.
No, not at all. I just we similar to our compatriots at the Food Fight Show, we often promise to have follow-up episodes that we never do. And actually, not to say that Food Fight Show never does. They actually do that sometimes, but. There's always plenty to talk about, and having that focused area, that's awesome, and I want more podcasts to listen to, so I endorse this, and you heard it here first. So that being said, since now we don't have to talk about enterprise DevOps anymore, we might be thinking about moving into our checkouts, but before we move into that, I want to just thing that you or avoid the MacGuffin, maybe, right? What should you be thinking about? Michael Ducy.
I don't know, Matt, because I have no idea what you just said.
Yeah, you broke up.
Okay, well then I'll try this again. So what would be... That's fine. It's good that you didn't catch most of it because I rambled, so I'll say it more succinctly. What is your one piece of advice? Shut up, Trevor. What is your one piece of advice for someone who's looking to address the challenge of DevOps in a quote-unquote enterprise?
So I guess the one piece of advice is that it's probably going to piss a lot of people off. And you have to be able to kind of be of the mindset to kind of push through that, right? And find your allies that'll help you in the organization make change.
Be very patient.
Excellent.
Yeah, be very patient.
Steve?
Is that on to me now? Okay. Mine would be, so it's kind of been the subject of a couple of my talks. I really think that sharing is the way to actually get started. Talking to people, sharing your pain, sharing information, stuff that inspires you, is definitely the way to sort of figure out and take the temperature of the organization.
Yeah, can people hear me?
Yes.
All right. Actually, I have a little bit more of a thought on that. One of our brilliant DevOps minds internally at Target, Jason Walker, who many folks, I think, on this show at least know, he's actually realizing, I think, what it's all about, because, again, it's hard to simplify a lot of this for a large enterprise. And he actually draws, he whiteboards a lot. He does these chop talks and talks people through what a lot of these things are. And he whiteboards this Venn diagram, basically, with 3 circles with some overlapping in the middle. And the 3 circles are collaboration, empathy, our buzzword of the year, and experiential learning. And DevOps really is kind of the center of all 3 of those things. And so when you've got that right, when you've got the group set so that they're collaborating across the silos, when they have perspective on the pain that each other is feeling, the empathy part, and they're willing to try things and learn and experiment and test and learn together, kind of at the center of the cultural fluffy stuff about this, that's kind of where we've been positioning DevOps. Now, you can get way deeper than that and you start getting into the technical aspects too, but that's largely how we've been thinking about it internally.
I think for me, the thing that I would focus on would be that you're probably already doing a lot of this, calling it different words and different terms. You probably already have some of these core competencies, and also realize that in larger organizations, there's quite a few people that have been through a lot of these amazing new transformations that are going to change the world, and might not necessarily start with the most excited from the perspective of, like, when you're doing an agile transformation, do a pilot and stack the deck for result.
So for me, I really need to. I agree with Steve. I'm all about advocating your problems and making sure that everybody is expressing what hurts, because usually you find out when you talk about it that everybody kind of has the same or similar hurts, and you can work collectively to solve those hurts. Like Link being a terrible piece of software. Sorry, Microsoft. I love you, but Link sucks.
Okay, Bridget.
And I guess the one piece of advice I would have for anyone at any size of company is that you can't actually do all of the things simultaneously. So it's okay to pick one or N of the things and just do those. If all you can manage is to get some ops coming to your scrum so that they have some idea of what's going to be flung over the wall at them later, I mean, that's a start. And it might not even require a huge amount of buy-in from, many levels of departmental sign-off. You may not be able to, get rid of your change advisory board immediately, but maybe you could add someone to it who actually knows what's going on, right? Like, there are small things you could do to try to make improvements. You don't have to do all the things.
Yeah.
Yep. We are getting ourselves up to the end, so it's time for checkouts when our panel shares something awesome with you. And first, I think we will go to Ducy. What is your checkout for our audience?
My checkout's going to be check out the new upcoming podcast, The Goat Farm, and you'll be able to catch it at goatcan.com.
Nice.
That was quick.
I think everyone's disappointed you're checking your selfie stick.
Well,
So maybe you can talk about that. So Ross, what do you have for us?
Well, I'll say ditto to what Ducy had, but sticking with the enterprise theme, I would actually say check out the videos from the DOS 14 Summit, so the Enterprise DevOps Summit. If you're really interested to see what these other enterprise-y type companies are doing in this space, there's some fascinating stuff there. There's a lot of interesting videos, so spend some time, watch those, look at the ones that people are watching the most. Those are probably the ones you want to start with. And I would say just plug and target a little bit. Look at our tech blog at target.github.io. There's a lot of talking we're doing around DevOps and some of the other stuff we're doing internally, and you'll be able to see a little bit more about what's going on there.
Cool. Steve.
Before the podcast, because I was scrambling for something interesting. But Twitter has just released basically a public feed of all the tweets from ever, and they're going to continue streaming them to the public. So everything since 2006 is now released, so you can go and data mine the brain of the internet for whatever you want, which was kind of a privilege reserved previously for partners of Twitter. It's kind of I don't know, for better or for worse, get your hashtag search on.
In my case, probably worse.
Yeah, all the tweets are now public record forever, so it's out there.
Snap.
Also,
Wait, Ducy, are you telling us you used to use even more hashtags, more extraneous hashtags than you do now?
Possibly.
Now you can find out.
my one last thing was DevOps Days Toronto is going to start forming up for the spring, so stay tuned for May.
Okay, Bridget, for your maiden voyage as a co-host, what was your checkouts?
All right. So I have two things I want you to check out. The first one is DevOpsDays.org, because maybe you don't work at a giant company that has done an internal DevOps Days yet, but you either want to get some inspiration as just the sort of talks people have had so that you can get your company to actually look for a DevOps Days in your area. And I'm expecting a pull request from Toronto shortly, since I changed the front page so that you don't actually have to have your specific dates in order to list your coming soon DevOps dates.
Awesome.
And then the other thing that I think we didn't even really touch on, but giant companies are not the only giant organizations that have massive internal IT problems. And one of the great talks from DevOps Days Vancouver last week was from Stephanie, who worked on the healthcare.gov rescue. And so we'll have a link in the show notes, and it's great just to watch her talk about the kinds of ways you can approach solving what seem to be intractable problems.
All right, Trevor.
I am muted. That's why I'm not talking. So this week there was a article I read about this thing called the worm robot. It's called from a group called Open Worm, and they mapped the neural matrix of a or anything like that. They just mapped they mirrored the neural network of the worm onto the bot, and the bot started acting like the worm, which is really cool.
I'm sorry, Trevor, you cut out a little bit. Could you please tell us what exactly did they map onto a bot?
So they mapped the neural network of a worm onto a robot, and then the robot started behaving like the worm.
Oh, wow.
This is also similar to what happened with the Twitter account Pete Chesbot.
Similar and not at all, but yes. Other cool things to check out. Big Hero 6 came out last weekend, and it is a lot of fun. I recommend watching it. There's some fun tech things in there, and some not fun tech things in there. But all around it was enjoyable. Something less enjoyable. Unfortunately, I didn't get the. I lost the name. I had the tab open and I closed it. But apparently there is a Barbie book released recently.
Oh my God! Yeah.
Barbie explains DevOps.
No, Barbie. I can be a software engineer, I believe is what it's called, or a computer engineer. And essentially, it's Barbie being anything but a computer engineer.
I will say
that's fun.
Yeah, that was a really terrible book, but if you would like to read a much better version of it, both Space Cat Gal and Swift on Security have done fantastic reworkings of it.
Great. That's important. Matt, round us out here.
Okay, I'll finish this up. So the first thing is, if you have seen the kind of cool Yak Shaving Expert stickers that have been floating around a couple conferences lately, there is a T-shirt that was on Teespring a while ago that was done by David Shaw. And the cool thing is this it's besides it being a hilarious shirt, he sent all the profits through to sending someone to Dev Boot Camp or something like that. And people have been trying to get it relaunched. So as of the time that I am looking right now, only 4 more pre-orders needed to relaunch it. There may be less by the time you're listening to that, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. Also, had this be a checkout before or not, but if I have, I don't care because it's awesome. I'm giving a shout-out, checkout for the book Customizing Chef by John Cowie at Etsy, who is also on our episode 11. At arresteddevops.com/11. It is a really cool and good intern stuff with Chef. You should read it because it's cool. And also, I am putting in a checkout. There is a supercut on YouTube that is all of the times that Roy on the IT crowd says, "Have you tried turning it on and off again?" And we'll put a link to that in the show notes. It is super fun. So, coming to an end, remember, we have a newsletter. I don't remember we have a newsletter, but eventually I will, and I will send it. You can subscribe to it at arresteddevops.com/bananastand. It is theoretically the best way to know about upcoming podcast episodes and cool news with DevOps.
Thanks to our sponsors, VictorOps and Redgate, and to our loyal listeners. If you enjoy Arrested DevOps, we'd appreciate it if you would visit arresteddevops.com/iTunes and leave us a review in the iTunes store. Thanks to Ducy, Ross, and Steve for joining us, and welcome Bridget to the show. Be sure to check us out at arresteddevops.com or at arresteddevops on Twitter.
We're always happy to get your input, ideas, or feedback at shows@arresteddevops.com. I'm Bridget at Bridget Cromhout.
I'm Matt at Matt Stratton.
And I'm Trevor at Trevor G. Hess.
We're Arrested DevOps. And remember,
there's always DevOps
in the banana stand.
It worked.
Later, y'all.
Oh, internet.